In the annals of history, there are wars that become infamous for all sorts of reasons. Maybe like World War II, they killed more than any other conflict. Maybe like the US Civil War, they tore a major world power apart. Yet it's not only for people killed or geopolitical significance that wars remain known. Sometimes it's for unlikely records. Records like that held by the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in history. Taking place entirely on the 27th of August, 1896, the conflict pitched the might of the British Empire against an upstart sultan and his band of supporters. Holed up in their palace, the Zanzibaris rejected a British ultimatum to surrender by 9 a.m. or face war. Just 38 minutes later, the conflict was already over. With the palace in ruins and 500 dead, the Zanzibaris surrendered before the clock struck 10. But there's more to this micro-war than just plucky locals making a doomed stand against evil colonizers. Both the war of imperial aggression and a noble conflict fought to end slavery. This is the strange tale of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, history's shortest conflict. Off the coast of Tanzania in eastern Africa lies a small, storied island. Zanzibar, also known as Unguja, the main island in the Zanzibar archipelago, is today mostly famous as a honeymoon destination and for being the birthplace of Freddie Mercury. At a mere 1,554 square kilometers, or half the size of Rhode Island, it seems like a typical tropical paradise. A tiny slice of heaven located just 35 kilometers off the shores of Tanzania's mainland. Yet Zanzibar's sleepy appearance belies a complex past, one which saw its iconic capital sit for centuries at the center of powerful trade routes, one which saw it play host to the shortest war in history. To understand just how Zanzibar came to find itself staring down the barrel of a British gunboat, we first need to understand who was in charge at the time and why. Because 19th century Zanzibar certainly wasn't ruled by Africans. Rather, it was under the domination of a sultanate that had its roots nearly 2,500 kilometers away in the Arabian land of Oman. Themselves previously under the thumb of the Portuguese, the Omanis had ejected the Europeans from Muscat way back in 1650 before slowly expanding to take over Portugal's former empire. By the early 19th century, this included most of Lisbon's old possessions in East Africa, creating a long strip of Omani power spreading all the way from Mogadishu in modern-day Somalia to southern Tanzania. But the real jewel in their imperial crown was Zanzibar Island. A focal point for marine route, Zanzibar in this era was almost like the Rule 34 of trade. If you could imagine it, you could buy it. There were spices like cloves grown on the island in great plantations, the only place outside of Asia that could supply them. There were commodities like ivory shipped in bulk and traded with distant nations. And of course, there were also slaves. If your mental picture of the slave trade is ships leaving West Africa to go to America, then returning to Europe laden with goods, just know that it was really so much bigger and so much worse than that. While slaves sold in Zanzibar did go to the southern US states and Latin America, they were also sold in the other direction across the Indian Ocean into slavery in places like Arabia and India. And that's just those who went out in ships. On Zanzibar itself, enslaved people were used to keep the great clove plantations running, creating dual feedback loops of human misery and economic gain. You can probably guess which one of those loops that Sultan Said bin cared about. The head of Oman's shining empire, Said watched Zanzibar's growing wealth from his throne in Muscat and thought, yeah, I'll have a piece of that. In 1832, he moved the empire's seat of power right across the ocean to this distant island, an island with an economy that now dwarfed that of Oman proper. Nor was Sultan Said bin the only one flocking to Zanzibar like a greedy moth chasing a flame made of pure gold. Zanzibar's capital, what we today call Stone Town, was booming in this era. And that boom was bringing in fortune seekers from Arabia, China, America, Europe, you name it. Importantly for our story, though, it was also bringing Indians. Important because India in 1832 was mostly dominated by the British through their East India Company. That meant, rightly or wrongly, that London considered all Indians to be British subjects. So when Indians started flocking to Zanzibar, that meant the world's most powerful empire suddenly taking an interest in Sultan Said bin's affairs. For most places in this era, Britain suddenly becoming interested in your affairs usually went about as well as a hungry lion suddenly becoming interested in your nutritional value. But not Zanzibar. At least not yet. The Omani Empire was simply too big for London to gobble up without choking. For now, becoming interested simply meant establishing a naval presence. But that would soon change because a great social upheaval was about to sweep the British Empire, one that would forever transform its relations with Zanzibar: the abolition of slavery. For most of its history, the British Empire had done pretty damn well out of the slave trade. Plantations in Jamaica, grand buildings in Bristol, the flourishing of the Liverpool docks, all of this and more had only been made possible by enthusiastically treating human beings as objects. Yet, for all the slave trade sent its poisoned wealth flowing back to the UK, there was another side to British public opinion. A better angel, known as abolition. In 1833, it was this better side that finally won out. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was basically the death knell for Britain's involvement in the slave trade. Although some jurisdictions held out a little bit longer, it marked a huge turning point in how the empire saw itself. Before long, London didn't just want to stop its own involvement in this horrifically immoral trade, it wanted to stop others from engaging in it too. Others, like the sultans in Zanzibar. As the 1840s slowly passed and became the 1850s, the British naval presence around the island increased. Nominally, the armed ships were there to stop British subjects, meaning Indians, from engaging in the trade. But by the 1850s, they were also using Zanzibar's harbour to launch anti-slavery patrols in the surrounding waters. Still, slavery continued to flourish on the island itself. For all their firepower, the Brits knew that they couldn't take on the Omani Sultanate without sustaining eye-watering losses. Instead, London would have to resort to good old-fashioned colonial meddling. In 1856, Sultan Said bin went off to the Great Palace in the sky, triggering a massive power struggle between two of his sons. Sensing an opportunity to divide the Sultanate, the British offered to mediate and came up with a simple solution. One son would get the Oman part of the empire, while the other would get Zanzibar. It was the beginning of formal British diplomatic power over the island, even if things didn't exactly work out as planned. Rather than being grateful London had helped him become ruler of Zanzibar, the new sultan was all like, you know what this island needs more of? It needs a bit more slavery. It wasn't until after his death in 1870 that the British were able to lean on his successor, Barghash bin Said, to finally close the slave market. Even then, Barghash only outlawed the trade, not the actual owning of slaves itself. Still, it was a start. The British were finally getting their way, and not just on the slavery issue. For while many Brits really did want to stomp out this abhorrent trade, it's not like they weren't simultaneously being massive colonialist douchebags. During Barghash's reign, London was furiously devouring the Sultan's territory on the mainland until the Zanzibar Sultanate had shrunk to little more than the archipelago itself. In fact, you could probably make an argument that forcing an end to slave trade only helped the British carve up the one-time empire by robbing Zanzibar of much of its wealth. Whatever the truth, by 1890 it was clear that the days of Zanzibar sitting at the centre of an empire to rival Britain's were long over. And it wasn't just thanks to London. The newly rising Germany had also been taking chunks out of the mainland. To the latest sultan on the throne, Ali bin Said, it was clear what would come next. Sometime in the next couple of years, either the Brits or the Germans would make their move. Zanzibar itself would be swallowed, annexed into a colonial enterprise. Faced with this inevitability, Ali played the only card he had left, a card that was little more than a dirty, dog-eared joker. That same year, 1890, Ali formally moved to make Zanzibar a British protectorate, something that would mean his becoming little more than a figurehead, but it would at least allow the royal house to survive. And so ended an era of a truly independent Zanzibar. At around the same time, the British signed the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty with Germany, allowing Berlin increased control of the mainland in return for London getting this storied island. Yet things weren't quite as simple as the Brits might have liked. Although he'd signed away his sovereignty, Ali bin Said and his family still wanted Zanzibar run a certain way. They still wanted a say in certain things. It would be this desire that would soon lead to the outbreak of war. When the Brits made Zanzibar a protectorate, they did so with three conditions. And yes, we agree it's super weird that the Brits got to act like they were doing the Zanzibaris a favour, but hey, that's the colonial era for you. Anyway, the first was pretty minor. They wanted to reopen Zanzibar to free trade. Fair enough. The second, though, was more controversial. In the event of a contested succession, London wanted a veto over any new sultan. But it was the third that threatened to blow everything up. The Brits wanted the island to totally outlaw slavery. By this time, Zanzibar was like the antebellum South, a slave economy where free labour was required to keep the plantations running. As far as the Arabic ruling class was concerned, Britain telling them to end slavery was like telling modern London to wean itself off Russian oligarch money. The moral case was clearly there, but clearly very few in charge actually gave a shit. This might be why, despite being the one to make Zanzibar a protectorate, Ali bin Said spent the following 3 years of his reign resisting abolition, basically pretending he had an urgent meeting every time the British brought it up. Yet, while this stopped a revolt among his wealthy subjects, it also made the British determined to replace him with someone more pliable. And in 1893, they got their chance. That spring, Ali bin Said unexpectedly dropped dead, leaving the throne wide open. Because Zanzibari law didn't automatically make the eldest son heir, multiple candidates presented themselves. This meant the succession was technically contested, which in turn meant that the British could activate their treaty rights and choose the new sultan. The pliable Hamid bin Thuwayni was picked, and everyone was happy. Well, they would have been, had Prince Khalid ibn Barghash not chosen that exact moment to come crashing into today's narrative. A 19-year-old hothead, Prince Khalid was an obstinate, ambitious, and defiant man. In other words, the sort of candidate who'd give the stuffy Brits a collective heart attack. He was also a major fan of reckless action. When Hamid bin Thuwayni was declared sultan, Khalid stormed into the waterfront Paris, barricaded himself in, and declared himself the rightful ruler of Zanzibar. It was a dramatic gesture, a giant middle finger in the face of the island's colonial masters. It was also doomed to fail. With only a small force to his name, Khalid obviously couldn't hold the palace. In no time at all, the British had managed to talk him down, and Hamid was able to take the throne. Only, it seemed both parties took different things from the negotiations. Khalid may have vacated the palace, but he hadn't given up on it. More, he seemed to have gotten the impression that were something to happen to Hamid, the fancy sultan's hat might be his. By contrast, the British were like, excellent show, chaps. We'll never have to worry about that Khalid fellow ever again, will we? Pip, pip, let's celebrate with some warm beer and some disgusting food. It would be these two conflicting understandings that set the stage for so much violence. Now let's fast forward 3 years to August the 25th, 1896. On that day, Sultan Hamid abruptly died in such a mysterious fashion that he might have well has been found with a knife in his back with a little label saying property of Prince Khalid, shortly after Khalid presented himself as a candidate for the now vacant throne. But the same issues that had made him such an unattractive choice 3 years earlier still applied. Hamid C had failed to outlaw slavery during his short reign, not only ignoring British demands, but also building up a private 1,000-man army loyal only to the Sultan. That meant London needed a spineless, compliant ruler more than ever. So when Khalid was all like, sweet, my turn to be Sultan, the Brits were all like, no thanks, old bean, we've got this Hamoud bin Mohammed chap. Better luck next time. But there would be no next time. Slighted for the second time in 3 years, Khalid finally let all his bottled up resentment come exploding out. Declaring himself Sultan, he marched on the palace, sending out a call to his supporters to rally to his banner. At the Grand Building, the new Imperial Army defected to his side, helping barricade it against attack. It was the beginning of a crisis that would grip Zanzibar for the next 2 days. By the time it was over, hundreds would be dead, and the British would have just won their easiest ever military victory. As the news of Khalid's coup swept the islands, the default opinion of pretty much everyone was there wasn't going to be a war. On the British side, attitudes were that Khalid had done this last time and had been talked down, so why not again? Meanwhile, on Khalid's side, the assumption seems to have been that showing the Brits he was serious would force them to negotiate. Still, even though everyone assumed this would just be a passing crisis, opening moves had to be made. At the palace, that meant rallying more people to Khalid's flag, now flying proudly above the grandiose wooden structure. It also meant securing whatever weaponry was available, which, it wasn't very much. Although Khalid's guys managed to find a Gatling gun, a few Maxim guns, and some 12-pounder artillery pieces, their force was so small that they were forced to round it out with a quartet of muzzle-loading bronze cannons dating back to the 1600s. But it was really just meant for show at this stage, as was the British response. The moment Khalid barricaded himself in the palace, troops were sent to points of key infrastructure to show British power hadn't evaporated. Likewise, the nearby warship HMS Sparrow was called into port alongside the HMS Rush and the HMS Philomel to provide an overwhelming show of arms. As sun set on that eventful day, then, nothing violent had yet happened, nor did anyone think it really would, with perhaps one exception. Basil Cave was the British consul in Zanzibar, a 31-year-old civil servant who'd only arrived the previous year. That evening, he quietly dispatched a cable to the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, asking, "Are we authorised, in the event of all attempts at a peaceful solution proving useless, to fire on the palace from the men of war?" It was the first sign that Khalid's seizure of power might not end in negotiations, but in a storm of fire and bloodshed. The next day, the slow massing of force continued on both sides. By now, Khalid had more than 3,000 men armed with flintlocks, in addition to his small artillery battery. His loyalists had also taken command of the royal yacht in the harbour, a lightly armed ship called the Glasgow. But while 3,000 men sounds impressive just said aloud, it had nothing on the British forces. By now, 2 more warships had entered the harbour, bringing with them the experienced Rear Admiral Harry Rawson. They were joined by forces assembled under the portly, mustachioed First Minister of Zanzibar, Lloyd Matthews, plus anywhere between 400 and 900 pro-Empire Zanzibaris that Basil Cave had convinced to fight. Unlike Khalid's forces, these guys were armed with breech-loaded rifles and they were backed by powerful gunboats. In short, if it came to a fight, it was obvious who was going to win. But the point we need to keep stressing is that no one seriously expected a fight to happen. Khalid's defiance in the face of such force only really made sense if you assume this was intended to strengthen his hand in negotiations. Likewise, the Brits were still pretty sure Khalid would stand down rather than risk his own life. But just in case he didn't, Basil Cave now had his response from London. "You are authorised," it read, "to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's government. Do not, however, attempt to take any action which you are not certain of being able to accomplish successfully." Buoyed by the response that evening, the Brits issued their final ultimatum. Rear Admiral Rawson sent a message to Khalid ordering him to leave the palace grounds by 9 a.m. the next morning, or they would consider war to have been declared between Britain and Zanzibar. Once again, though, Khalid managed to catastrophically misjudge the situation. All through the night, the palace remained a hive of activity. As dawn broke, it was on a massed force, now aiming its small artillery battery at the British ships. It was almost as if Khalid thought he was playing a simple game of chicken, that the Brits, unwilling to cause mass death over a simple succession crisis, would naturally swerve first. But Khalid was wrong. Rather than a game of chicken, this was like watching a single stupid hen try to stop a speeding locomotive with a defiant "what?" And when it finally hit, there would be nothing left of Khalid's dreams but scattered feathers and a lot of blood. At 8 a.m. on August 27, 1896, a message was taken to the British forces. Khalid had decided the time for bluffing was over. He now wanted to sit down and negotiate an end to this crisis that would benefit everyone. But by that Thursday morning, the British had already decided the time for bluffing was over. Rather than parley, they sent a terse response repeating that Khalid needed to lower his flag and evacuate the palace, or London would treat it as a declaration of war. To which Khalid gave a reply that positively rings with foreshadowing and dramatic irony. "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." After that, all either side could do was watch as the city's clock tower ticked towards Rear Admiral Rawson's deadline. Around an hour later, the bell chimed 9 times. And so began the shortest war in human history. The moment the hour struck, Rawson ordered the gunboats HMS Raccoon, Thrush and Sparrow to open fire. Since the palace in Zanzibar stands right on the waterfront, this meant firing at almost point-blank range. Heavy naval guns blasting into a wooden structure crammed with people. From its opening salvo, the conflict followed a grimly inevitable path. In the first 2 minutes, British shells obliterated Khalid's small artillery battery, turning the guns into twisted metal almost before they got a shot off. While one Zanzibari volley managed to badly injure a British sailor, it was the last casualty that the Brits would take. At 9:02 a.m, the first shell smashed through the roof of the palace, blowing Khalid's defenders to smithereens and starting fires that would soon engulf everything. At the same time, Khalid is said to have realized his plan had failed and legged it, escaping out a back exit as heavy guns turned the palace he'd desired for so long into broken matchsticks. Yet the battle wasn't only taking place on land. In the harbour, the Zanzibari royal yacht Glasgow had attacked Rawson's ship the moment the firing had started. In what may be the shortest engagement in naval history, the British responded by immediately sinking the Glasgow. By that time, the war was going so badly for Zanzibar that Rawson even had his ship stop fighting to rescue the yacht's crew. For the next 40 minutes or so, British artillery pounded the shoreline, blasting homes into rubble, reducing the waterfront to a wasteland. We say 40 minutes or so because one of the buildings instantly turned to ruins was the clock tower. One of the first volleys obliterated its top, the only public timepiece, in the center of Zanzibar town, a town in which very, very few people owned watches. Amid the chaos that followed, none of those very few people bothered to check how much time had elapsed, hence different sources giving a different length to the Anglo-Zanzibar War of anything between 38 and 50 minutes. What's not in dispute is that the actual fighting was over in less than an hour. By the time 10 a.m. rolled around, the palace was in flames, Khalid's flag had been pulled down, the prince was missing, and 500 of his followers were dead. For the next few hours, British troops and pro-Empire Zanzibari units fanned out across the city looking for any pockets of resistance. Right into the afternoon, gunshots could be heard cracking on the outskirts. But really, everything was already over. That same afternoon, the British had their candidate, Hamoud bin Mohammed, formally made Sultan of Zanzibar. One of his first acts would be to finally abolish slavery, ending centuries of exploitation on the island. It was the end of both a dark, if preposterous, era in Zanzibari history, as well as the end of this strange little micro-war. But it's not the end of the story today. No, we still have one final act to cover, one final chapter where we ask an all-important question. What did it all mean? While the fighting may have been over in maybe 3/4 of an hour, it's arguable that the war itself lasted until the end of the day. That's because it wasn't until evening that the search for Prince Khalid was called off, not because he'd vanished, but because the British finally found out where he'd fled to. The German consulate. The rules of diplomacy meant that there was no way Basil Cave could just barge in and have the prince dragged away, so the British simply insisted the Germans hand him over. To which the Germans presumably gave a very smug "Nein." As the rival colonial power in the region, Germany was more than happy to dick over London in any way that it could, and right now that meant guaranteeing Khalid's safety. For all Basil Cave demanded and begged, the best he could get out of Berlin was that Khalid would not be allowed to set foot on British soil again. On October the 2nd, the prince was quietly smuggled out and across the water to the German colonies on the mainland. He left behind only a legacy of physical ruin. The British bombardment had destroyed the palace and badly damaged the old customs house. The centre of Stone Town was a mess of shattered homes, pulverized streets, and broken lives. In the end, the Brits had gotten what they wanted, the end of the evils of slavery and a chance to increase the other evil of colonialism. And all it had taken had been the near destruction of this magnificent old harbour town. London did eventually catch up with Prince Khalid. During World War I, British forces invaded German East Africa and found their old nemesis living in exile in Dar es Salaam. Still a wanted man, Khalid was punished by being sent into exile on St. Helena, the same fate that had once befallen Napoleon. But while Napoleon died on the remote island, Khalid was free to return after his sentence ended. He eventually passed away in Mombasa, Kenya, in 1927. As for Zanzibar's sultans, they would never again attempt an uprising against their colonial overlords. The island would remain a British protectorate right through till 1963. But its independence would be short-lived. In 1964, Zanzibar's Arab rulers were overthrown by their African subjects in a revolution. Zanzibar then joined with the mainland of Tanganyika to become the modern-day country of Tanzania. In the century and a quarter since that fateful day in 1896, the Anglo-Zanzibar War has stayed infamous, even as other, far larger wars have faded into obscurity. In all honesty, this is entirely due to its status as the world's shortest war. Had it lasted a few days rather than minutes, it's doubtful that we'd be talking about it right now. Yet while the Anglo-Zanzibar War's notoriety may be down entirely to its length, that doesn't mean it isn't worth remembering. In their brief, brutal bombardment of a near defenseless town, the British showed their growing willingness to use unnecessary force against colonial subjects, a willingness that would reach its apogee 2 years later with the devastating shelling of Omdurman in Sudan. Likewise, the conflict is notable for demonstrating the growing military tech gap, putting Europe at the forefront of weaponry that would soon be used to devastate Europe in World War I. In short, the war may have lasted as little as 38 minutes, not much longer than this video, but in those short moments, the Anglo-Zanzibar War demonstrated enough cruelty, hubris, and destruction to fill a dozen larger conflicts, a timely reminder that no matter how small the scale, it is always ruinous. So I do hope you enjoyed this video. We mentioned Napoleon in this one, and if you want to check out one of Napoleon's battles, I'm going to link to it on the screen now. It's a great video. You'll enjoy it if you enjoyed this one. Please do check it out, and thanks for watching.